All right, now to some media news. It is the end of an era. After 33 years, CBS has officially aired the final episode of The Late Show with host Stephen Colbert signing off last night. For the show's final week, Colbert welcomed a slew of A-listers like his pal Jon Stewart, Bruce Springsteen, and Steven Spielberg. But details for the finale remained largely under wraps. There were no guests or segments announced in advance. Fans lined up for hours outside of the Ed Sullivan Theater in New York City. So, Moshe, how did it go?
It was definitely an emotional night, Jill, and we should note that his competitors last night, namely Jimmy Fallon and Jimmy Kimmel, decided to run repeats. So all the focus would be on Colbert for his final show after more than a decade on the air there at CBS. There was a lot of invocation of the history of late night. In the beginning, you saw a montage of people like Johnny Carson and Jack Benny and Jay Leno and Letterman and so on and so forth. And so it felt in part like a sort of memorial to late night in general. And that's something we'll get to here in a second as we talk about the predicament of late night comedy here in the U.S. But the show itself did have an emotional start. Colbert began the show by addressing the audience in studio, as well as us at home on camera. Among the things he said is that in part he saw his role was to feel the news with you, saying last night, I sure have felt the news, and I just want to let everyone know in here and out there how important you've been to what we've done. He talked about referring to the show as the joy machine, amidst everything that has been happening in the world over the course of the past decade. In the studio audience at the Ed Sullivan Theater last night included a whole bunch of celebrities, longtime friends of Colbert. That included actors Bryan Cranston, Paul Rudd, and Ryan Reynolds, who had various moments with him in the early part of the show. And there was a huge buildup. Who's going to be his final guest? Who's going to be his final guest? They had a short sketch implying that the Pope was going to be his final guest. But ultimately, the final guest was Paul McCartney. And his appearance really gave the finale sort of a fitting Ed Sullivan Theater resonance, because it was in that exact theater back in 1964 on the Ed Sullivan Show. It really remains one of the buildings, if not the building's main cultural moment. The Beatles appearing on American television on the Ed Sullivan Show. And so McCartney's return to that stage 62 years later add an extra layer of history to the show. McCartney noted during the interview that he can still hear the girls screaming on the balcony, and he actually surprised Stephen with a signed photo from that Beatles performance in the Ed Sullivan Theater. Colbert joking that McCartney wrote on the photo, "To Stephen, you're better than the Beatles," to which McCartney wanted to make very clear it doesn't say that. Colbert saying, "When I'm done, it will say that, Paul." McCartney reflected on his lifetime in music, on his time in the Beatles. He talked about how he's still writing music after all of these decades. And the two men also talked about how they don't like change, as Colbert, of course, is experiencing a major change here with the end of his show. And then a really powerful end to the show as McCartney joined Colbert and his band, as well as his first band leader, Jon Batiste, who was with the show for a number of years before leaving, returned to the stage to all perform together Hello, Goodbye, classic Beatles song that obviously had a lot of symbolism, given it was Colbert's last show. And they ended by inviting the entire show team, as well as folks from the audience, on stage to sing and dance with them.
Now looking at the business decision behind his show's cancellation, CBS Paramount announced the end of the show back in June of 2025. The network at the time said that it was purely a financial decision against a challenging backdrop in late night, saying it is not related in any way to the show's performance, content, or other matters happening at Paramount. Colbert had been the highest rated host in that time slot for most of his run, but advertising revenue for his show had dropped about 40% since 2018. As we know, young people are increasingly turning to streaming and social media, but the timing did have some people thinking that the decision was political.
Right. If you recall here, the announcement of the show's cancellation came shortly after Colbert accused Paramount of taking a, quote, big fat bribe from the network when effectively Paramount signed a $16 million check to Trump to settle a lawsuit he had filed related to editing he felt was improper at 60 Minutes. Now, many internally at CBS felt actually this is a BS lawsuit that we could have fought. But ultimately, one of the things Paramount wanted at that time was approval by the federal government for their merger, and that approval would happen. So Colbert and others accused them of a quid pro quo and said that part of the deal here was clearly killing me. Now, at the same time, folks over at Paramount say, no, this was merely a financial decision here that ultimately Colbert was costing us $100 million a year and making less than 70. And so losing $40 million a year. Now, the counterpoint there is, why don't you cut down on the budget there at Colbert as opposed to killing the entire enterprise? Bottom line, late night has had issues, not just at CBS, but a number of networks now for years. Interesting numbers out of a Variety story, Jill. As of 2017, late night television shows were bringing in just over $520 million in revenue. 6 years later, down 60%, just above $200 million in revenue. So down by more than half in just a few years as the ratings numbers have gone down. Well, with fewer people watching, advertisers are willing to pay less. Those viewers are much older. And of course, there's the idea that these shows have gotten particularly political in recent years. For decades, you had people like Johnny Carson or Jay Leno or Dave Letterman that, well, were trying to be equal opportunity critics when it came to politics. They said, well, we have people who watch us in both red states and blue states, and so it's not on us to pick a team. So ultimately, one of the impacts here of Colbert was, well, he became very quickly, he found his legs really, after struggling for the first few months on his show by getting political, sort of reviving some aspects of his Colbert Report that he used to do over on Comedy Central. But ultimately, time and time again, night after night, was going after Donald Trump. So he quickly saw some traction there, some buzz there. And so you saw others, whether it was John Oliver, Hassan Minhaj, Sam Bede, Seth Meyers, Jimmy Kimmel, you could say for years was also pretty critical of Trump and pretty liberal. But certainly he, had the same line there. And so there's a lot of people who felt sort of not spoken to anymore by the late night shows as they double down on liberal politics. And so that's one of the interesting impacts here that Colbert had. Now, he would argue, and the people around him would argue, that he's just speaking truth to power, and that's what he saw as his role. But again, that was very much a deviation from what you'd seen for decades in late night television. And as people sort of write the obituary, if you will, of the Late Show and of late night television on the whole, you keep seeing cuts. You're not going to be surprised in the coming years, Jill, for other networks to potentially replace their late night shows with much cheaper options as opposed to what we saw in the heyday of late night television. But one thing did catch our attention. Conan O'Brien, no stranger late night television, was the host of that later show on NBC for years, then had the Tonight Show. For a brief period, there was a whole controversy with Jay Leno there. Then eventually went over to TBS and had his show. Well, he's still hosting award shows and doing his own comedy, but he's also speaking out about comedy. And interestingly, he had this discussion about comedy and the state of comedy in the U.S., especially in regards to Trump, several months ago over the Oxford Union in the UK. We put this clip up back in January, but I want to play a bit of Conan O'Brien and his assessment of where he stayed very vague here. He didn't go after specifically Colbert or anybody else, but spoke generally about where comedians could go awry when it comes to dealing with comedy around Trump. Take a listen.
Some comics go the route of, I'm going to just say F Trump all the time, or that's their comedy. And I think, well, now a little bit you're being co-opted because you're so angry. You've been lulled, it's like a siren leading you into the rocks. You've been lulled into just saying F Trump, F Trump, F Trump, screw this guy, and I think you've now put down your best weapon, which is being funny, and you've exchanged it for anger. And that person or any person like that would say, well, things are too serious now. I don't need to be funny. And I think, well, if you're a comedian, you always need to be funny. You just have to find a way. And you just have to find a way to channel that anger into a way that is, because good art will always be a great weapon, will always be a perfect weapon against power. But if you're just screaming and you're just angry, you've lost your best tool in the toolbox.
Also, that Variety piece that you had mentioned noted that a lot of people are looking for an escape from the politics, especially at that time slot right before you're going to sleep.
And Joe, we didn't even get into the fact that the way that people take in their comedy these days is, well, on Instagram and on TikTok and on YouTube. So the idea that you're trying to you need to watch live tonight at 11:30 p.m., well, that ship has sailed a long, long time ago. And that was the core revenue stream for these shows.
And one other quick thing that we have talked about here on this podcast before is that celebrities, which used to be the big guests on these late night shows, stopped doing them because they realized they could promote their movies and whatever else they're doing themselves on social media or on different platforms. And so who's left? Politicians. Is that who you want to watch at 11:30? I don't know.
And podcasters, so you can listen to on a podcast. And yeah, I mean, ultimately, celebs still went on, some of them still, Jill, but also the exclusivity of the celebrity is no longer like such a thing. You know, it's the reason why the red carpet has sort of come and gone. It still exists, but like you used to see these stars on the red carpet, it used to be a big deal. But like now you can follow their TikTok channel and you can follow their Instagram channel and you can see them all the freaking time. And so like the idea, it's like, oh my God, I want to see this like TV star or movie star on late night comedy show tonight. Okay. But like they literally like posted 3 reels today on Instagram. Like I don't need to watch them tonight.
Meanwhile, CBS is going to be replacing The Late Show with Comics Unleashed with Byron Allen. And as for Colbert, Warner Brothers has actually tapped him to write Lord of the Rings next installment. Apparently, Colbert's a super fan.
Yeah, a total super fan, Jill. I don't think he's going to be far from TV, though. His buddy, Jon Stewart, still hosts The Daily Show at least once a week on Mondays. And so I imagine you'll see a revival of maybe the Colbert character. And Colbert will probably pop up over there, pop up with his other buddies like Fallon and Kimmel and Myers and Oliver.